May 10th, 1940. 15,000 feet above Liège, Belgium. Hauptmann Adolf Galland couldn't suppress his smirk as he positioned his sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 behind the ungainly British fighter. The Hurricane below him looked like it belonged in a museum, not in combat against the Luftwaffe's finest. Its thick wings, boxy fuselage, and fabric-covered tail seemed almost comical compared to the clean lines of German fighters. Galland transmitted to his wingman, unable to hide his amusement. "The British have sent us flying haystacks. This will be easy shooting." That morning, Flight Officer Fredman of 607 Squadron was flying one of the first combat missions over the continent, his Hurricane lumbering upward in tight formation. German pilots circling above watched with a mixture of curiosity and derision. To aviators accustomed to the progressive designs emerging from German factories, this British fighter appeared almost primitive. Fabric-covered rear fuselage like a World War I relic, thick wings that seemed to catch every molecule of air resistance, a profile that suggested more brawn than brains. What the Luftwaffe couldn't know, what seemed impossible to imagine as they positioned for their first attacks on these strange British machines, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the fighter that would break the back of Germany's invasion plans. Within 4 months, these flying haystacks would become the most feared aircraft in British skies, their 8 Browning machine guns accounting for more German aircraft destroyed than any other weapon in Britain's arsenal. The mathematics of survival were already loaded in those thick wings. 2,104 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire that could deliver 160 bullets per second into a target zone, enough concentrated firepower to saw a bomber in half. The transformation began that May morning when Galland dove on Fredman's Hurricane. The German ace, who would eventually claim 104 victories in the war, fired a precise burst from his 20mm cannon and twin machine guns. Fredman's Hurricane shuddered under the impacts but continued flying. Galland repositioned and fired again. Still the Hurricane flew. On his third pass, Galland finally sent the British fighter down, but not before emptying nearly his entire ammunition load. Something was wrong. That much firepower should have destroyed 3 conventional fighters. As Fredman's Hurricane tumbled toward Belgian farmland, Galland keyed his radio. "These British machines are tougher than they look. Use caution." That warning would be repeated across Luftwaffe frequencies in the coming months, as German pilots discovered that everything they thought they knew about air combat was about to be rewritten by a fighter they'd dismissed as obsolete. The Hawker Hurricane had emerged from a quiet office in Kingston upon Thames in 1933, where chief designer Sidney Camm sat surrounded by blueprints of biplane fighters. The RAF was transitioning slowly, reluctantly, away from open cockpit biplanes, and Camm saw an opportunity. The Air Ministry wanted a modern fighter, something that could reach 300 miles per hour and carry 8 machine guns. Revolutionary specifications for 1933. Camm's design was deliberately conservative in some ways, radical in others. He retained the traditional construction methods Hawker had perfected, a tubular steel frame covered with fabric. This seemed outdated even then, but Camm understood something the theorists didn't. Ease of repair matters more than theoretical performance when you're losing aircraft faster than factories can build them. The prototype that first flew on November 6, 1935, shocked observers who expected a clean, all-metal monoplane. Instead, they saw what appeared to be a biplane that had lost a wing. Fabric-covered rear fuselage, thick, almost chunky wings, a greenhouse canopy that provided excellent visibility but added drag. Test pilot George Bullman climbed out after his first flight with a simple assessment. It's simple to fly and has no apparent vices. In the world of fighter aircraft, where temperamental handling could kill more pilots than the enemy, that was the highest praise possible. What Bullman didn't mention, what couldn't be captured in a test report, was how the Hurricane felt like an extension of the pilot. The controls were perfectly balanced, responsive without being twitchy. The thick wings provided a stability that made gunnery almost easy. The wide landing gear made it nearly impossible to ground loop on landing. In an air force about to be flooded with partially trained pilots, these characteristics would prove invaluable. Production began at Hawker's facilities in 1937. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, 497 Hurricanes equipped 18 RAF squadrons. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough, but it was what Britain had. The first combat over France in early 1940 confirmed every German prejudice. The Hurricane was slower than the Messerschmitt Bf 109, reaching only 305 miles per hour compared to the German fighter's 350. It couldn't climb as fast. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Bf 109 had a significant advantage. Oberleutnant Werner Mölders, already an ace from the Spanish Civil War, encountered Hurricanes on December 22, 1939. His combat report was dismissive. The British fighter turns well but lacks speed. It cannot disengage from combat. Our tactics will exploit this weakness. Attack from altitude, fire, climb away. The Hurricane cannot follow. The Battle of France in May 1940 seemed to confirm German confidence. 7 Hurricane squadrons sent to support French forces were decimated. They lost 200 aircraft in 3 weeks, shot down, destroyed on the ground, or abandoned during the chaotic retreat. RAF pilots who survived spoke of being overwhelmed by numbers and outperformed by German fighters. The Hurricane's thick wings and fabric construction seemed like fatal flaws, but something strange was happening in those desperate battles that German intelligence failed to analyse properly. Hurricanes that should have been destroyed were limping home. One pilot landed with 23 cannon shell holes in his aircraft. The fabric covering had allowed the explosive shells to pass through without detonating properly. The metal structure beneath remained intact. Another Hurricane returned with its entire tail section shredded by machine gun fire, the pilot unhurt behind the armoured seat. When Hurricanes did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. 8 Browning machine guns firing in unison created a stream of lead that literally sawed German bombers in half. One pilot described watching a Heinkel 111 simply disintegrate under fire, the wings separating from the fuselage, the crew compartment shredded. On May 27, 1940, 13 Hurricanes from 501 Squadron intercepted 24 Heinkel 111 bombers, escorted by 20 Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighters over Dunkirk. The British pilots, outnumbered 3-1, tore into the German formation. When the smoke cleared, 11 Heinkels were destroyed, several more damaged, and the Hurricane squadron had suffered minimal losses. German bomber crews began reporting something unexpected. The British fighters with the thick wings were more dangerous than the sleek Spitfires. The Hurricanes pressed attacks closer, their stable gun platforms allowing sustained accurate fire, and they seemed impossible to shoot down. One German rear gunner reported putting over 100 rounds into a Hurricane at close range, seeing the hits clearly and watching the fighter fly away apparently undamaged. By the end of June 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone, the RAF had 32 Hurricane squadrons and 19 Spitfire squadrons. The Hurricane outnumbered its more famous stablemate nearly 2-1, and for good reason. It was cheaper to build, taking 10,300 man-hours compared to 15,200 for a Spitfire. It was easier to repair, with that fabric and tube construction allowing field mechanics to patch holes with basic tools. And it was easier to fly, with handling characteristics that kept inexperienced pilots alive long enough to gain experience. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, studied intelligence reports on British fighters with growing confidence. The RAF was outnumbered, outgunned, and flying inferior aircraft. The Hurricane was slow, antiquated in construction, and vulnerable to fire. The coming air campaign over England would be a formality. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain officially began. What followed would completely reverse every assumption about the Hurricane. The first German pilots to encounter massed Hurricane formations over England experienced a shock. These weren't the scattered, desperate fighters from France. These were coordinated squadrons, vectored to intercept by radar, fighting over their own territory with unlimited endurance. And they were using tactics specifically designed to exploit the Hurricane's strengths. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, had developed a system that would prove revolutionary. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming raids, operations rooms plotted their courses, controllers vectored fighters to intercept. The Hurricanes, with their excellent endurance, could orbit at altitude waiting for orders. When the call came, they dove on German bomber formations with devastating effect. Squadron leader Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's top aces, described Hurricane tactics. We didn't try to dogfight the 109s, that was suicide. We went for the bombers. The Hurricane was perfect for it. Stable, tough, and armed like a battleship. You could sit behind a Heinkel or Dornier at 250 yards and just hold the button down. The 8 guns created a pattern of fire impossible to evade. On August 8, 1940, Hurricanes from 145 Squadron fired the first shots of the main battle over the English Channel. They intercepted a formation of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, the aircraft that had terrorized Europe. The result was a massacre. 6 Stukas destroyed in as many minutes, the German formation scattering in panic. The Hurricane pilots returned to base untouched. The Germans tried different tactics. They sent fighters ahead to clear the skies. The Hurricanes climbed above them. They tried high-altitude bombing. The Hurricanes, with better endurance than the Bf-109s, simply waited for the German fighters to reach their fuel limits and leave, then tore into the unescorted bombers. They tried low-level attacks. The Hurricanes, with their wide landing gear and benign handling, operated from rough forward airfields and caught the Germans before they reached their targets. On August 15th, the Luftwaffe launched its largest attack of the battle. Over 700 sorties, waves of bombers from multiple directions designed to overwhelm the defences. The RAF met them with everything available. Hurricane Squadron scrambled 5, 6, 7 times that day. Pilots landed, refueled, rearmed and went back up. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 aircraft. Fighter Command had lost 34, and nearly all the British pilots had survived, parachuting over friendly territory. Sergeant Anton Hard of Kampfgeschwader 53 was flying as a gunner in a Heinkel 111 that day. He survived the war and later recounted the experience. We approached the target confident. Our fighter escort was strong. Then they came, the Hurricanes. Not the graceful Spitfires we'd been warned about, but the heavy British fighters with the thick wings. They came from above and behind, materializing out of the sun. The sound of their guns was like ripping cloth, magnified 1,000 times. I returned fire, saw my tracers strike one fighter, good hits on the wings. It didn't matter. The Hurricane flew through my fire and its guns didn't stop. The fuselage of our bomber, armour-plated, was torn open like paper. The Hurricane's guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out continuous streams of bullets. Our pilot tried to evade, but the British fighter followed easily, its guns never stopping. I watched the wings separate from our aircraft. I was thrown clear by the explosion. Of our crew of 5, only I survived. The Hurricane that destroyed us flew away as if nothing had happened. What Hart had experienced was the Hurricane's greatest strength, firepower combined with resilience. Each of the 8 Browning machine guns fired 200 rounds per minute. At the standard convergence distance of 250 yards, all 8 streams intersected in a killing zone 6 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that zone faced 160 half-inch bullets per second. German bombers, designed to withstand rifle-caliber fire from the ground, were simply torn apart. The ammunition itself was a masterpiece of industrial production. Each 303 caliber round was manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The belts mixed armour-piercing incendiary, and tracer rounds in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite. The armour-piercing rounds punched through the thin top armour of German bombers. The incendiary compound ignited fuel and aluminum structure, and the tracers allowed pilots to walk their fire onto target. But it was the Hurricane's resilience that truly shocked German pilots. Oberleutnant Julius Neumann of Jagdgeschwader 27 survived being shot down by a Hurricane on August 24th. His post-interrogation report captured the German confusion. I positioned behind what I thought was a crippled Hurricane. The aircraft was trailing smoke, flying erratically. I closed to 100 meters and fired a long burst, perhaps 3 seconds. My 20mm cannon and machine guns all struck the target. I saw pieces fly off. The Hurricane turned toward me. I expected it to explode or at least dive away. Instead, it turned, and its 8 guns opened fire. My Messerschmitt was hit perhaps 10 times in 2 seconds. The engine seized immediately. The entire front of the aircraft was destroyed. I barely escaped. The Hurricane I thought I'd killed, that flew away. I later learned it landed safely at its base. This is not possible with any aircraft I know. The fabric and tube construction that looked so primitive was proving almost immune to explosive damage. 20mm cannon shells designed to detonate on contact with stressed metal skin instead punched through the fabric without triggering their fuses. The metal structure beneath, the tubular steel frame, was immensely strong. One Hurricane returned to base with 47 cannon shell holes. The ground crew counted them during repairs that took less than a day. Fabric patches, some structural bracing, new ammunition, and the aircraft was operational again. The Hurricane's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine proved equally resilient. The liquid-cooled V12 had been designed with redundancy in mind. Coolant lines were armoured. The cooling system had reserve, capacity. One pilot flew 60 miles back to base with half his coolant gone, and the temperature gauge in the red. The engine kept running. As August turned to September, German losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The Luftwaffe was losing 4 aircraft for every 3 RAF fighters destroyed. More critically, German pilots who bailed out became prisoners, while RAF pilots who survived returned to duty. The mathematics of attrition favoured the defenders. Hermann Göring called a meeting of his commanders on September 3rd. His frustration was evident. Why are we failing? We have superior aircraft, more experienced pilots, greater numbers. The answer from his commanders was uniform: the Hurricane. Major Gunter Rahl, commanding a Bf 109 grouper, spoke bluntly. The British fighter that looks antiquated, that we dismissed as inferior, it's destroying our bombers faster than we can replace them. Our pilots report the same thing repeatedly. The Hurricane is unkillable with conventional weapons, and its guns destroy our aircraft with ridiculous ease. One burst and a bomber is finished. Our crews are terrified of it. Göring refused to accept this. He ordered new tactics, more fighter escorts, higher altitude approaches. None of it worked. The Hurricanes kept coming. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe changed strategy. Instead of attacking airfields, they would bomb London, break British morale through terror. This decision, made in frustration, would prove fatal to German plans. The massed raids on London concentrated German aircraft in predictable formations on predictable routes. Hurricane squadrons, no longer spread thin defending multiple airfields, could mass for concentrated attacks. September 15th became the climax of the battle. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London, over 200 bombers each wave, heavily escorted. Every available Hurricane squadron was vectored to intercept. The first raid appeared over London at 11:30 in the morning. RAF fighters tore into it from multiple directions. Hurricanes concentrated on the bombers, Spitfires engaged the escorts. The sky over London filled with contrails, burning aircraft, parachutes. The second raid came at 2 p.m, another massive formation. Again the RAF rose to meet it. Hurricane pilots, some flying their 3rd or 4th sortie of the day, pressed attacks with desperate determination. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost 61 aircraft. Fighter Command had lost 31. More importantly, the German formations had been broken up before reaching their targets. Bombs fell scattered across London rather than concentrated on docks and factories. Hauptmann Rolf Pingel, a Bf 109 pilot who became a prisoner of war that day, later described the battle. We approached London expecting to overwhelm the defences through sheer numbers. Instead, we found the sky full of British fighters. The Hurricanes attacked from every direction, never stopping, pressing through our escort. I watched one Hurricane fly directly. Through the formation it was attacking, guns blazing, pieces flying off German bombers. The Hurricane took hits from multiple gunners but continued its attack run. When it emerged from the formation, it climbed for altitude and attacked again. I shot down a Hurricane that day, my only victory. It took all my cannon ammunition and most of my machine gun rounds. I literally ran out of ammunition, destroying one British fighter. Then another Hurricane bounced me. I was out of ammunition, and I was shot down. This was our experience that day, ammunition exhaustion before the battle was won. 2 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The Hurricane had stopped them. The final statistics of the Battle of Britain told a remarkable story. Of 2,139 German aircraft, claimed destroyed by RAF Fighter Command between July and October 1940, Hurricanes accounted for 1,193. The slower, less glamorous fighter that German pilots had mocked had achieved 58% of British air victories. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of 249 Squadron earned the only Victoria Cross awarded to Fighter Command during the entire war for actions in a Hurricane on August 16th. His aircraft was hit by cannon fire from a Bf 110, setting the fuel tank ablaze. Badly burned, Nicholson remained in the cockpit long enough to shoot down his attacker before bailing out. His Hurricane, despite being a flying furnace, had remained controllable long enough for him to complete his mission. The contrast between German and British fighter production told another story. Britain was producing 300 fighters per week by September 1940, 2/3 of them Hurricanes. The simple, conventional construction allowed for rapid mass production. Women who had never worked in factories before were assembling Hurricanes after just weeks of training. The tubular frame went together like an erector set. The fabric covering, anachronistic as it seemed, could be applied by semi-skilled workers. Germany, focusing on more sophisticated all-metal construction, couldn't match these production rates. By October 1940, as the battle wound down, the Hurricane had evolved significantly from the aircraft that German pilots had mocked in May. Metal wings had completely replaced fabric-covered ones, increasing diving speed by 80 miles per hour. Constant speed propellers dramatically improved climb rate. 100-octane fuel, imported from America, allowed the Merlin engine to produce 1,300 horsepower in emergency boost, nearly 30% more power than earlier versions. The Hurricane Mk-A entered service in September with even more improvements. Slight aerodynamic refinements increased top speed to 342 miles per hour. The engine was uprated to 1,085 horsepower for continuous operation. Most significantly, some variants now carried 12 Browning machine guns instead of 8, creating a stream of fire that defied comprehension. One German bomber pilot who survived being shot down by a 12-gun Hurricane described it as flying through a wall of steel. But even as the Hurricane evolved, its fundamental character remained unchanged: stable, forgiving, deadly, and nearly impossible to kill. RAF pilot Roland Beaumont, who flew Hurricanes throughout 1940, summarized the aircraft perfectly. Throughout the bad days of 1940, 87 Squadron had maintained a proficient formation aerobatic team. The precise flying controls and responsive engines permitted precision formation through loops, barrel rolls, turns and rolls off half loops. My Hurricane was never hit in the battles of France and Britain, and in over 700 hours on type, I never experienced an engine failure. The Hurricane didn't win through superior performance. It won through reliability, firepower, and an almost absurd level of structural toughness. German pilots who had laughed at its antiquated appearance in May were terrified of it by October. The transformation of German opinions was captured in a Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from November 1940, recently discovered in British archives. It had been marked secret, too demoralising for general distribution. The British Hurricane fighter initially appeared to be an inferior design. Fabric-covered control surfaces, thick wings, conservative engineering. Combat experience has completely reversed this assessment. The Hurricane is the most difficult British fighter to destroy. Its construction allows it to absorb damage that would down any Luftwaffe aircraft. Multiple pilots have expended their entire ammunition load on a Hurricane without destroying it. The Hurricane's armament of 8 machine guns creates firepower unprecedented in fighter combat. Our bomber crews report that a sustained burst from a Hurricane literally cuts aircraft in half. Evasion is impossible. The concentration of fire guarantees destruction. Most concerning is the rate at which the British produce these fighters. Intelligence estimates that Britain is manufacturing 200 Hurricanes per month, more than all German fighter production combined. The simple construction allows for rapid repairs. Damaged Hurricanes return to service in hours or days, while our aircraft require weeks of factory repair. The Hurricane is the weapon that has defeated our air offensive over Britain. As the battle moved into winter, the Hurricane began taking on new roles. Fighter-bomber variants carried 500-pound bombs under the wings, turning bomber-destroyer into ground attacker. Night fighter Hurricanes, flown by pilots who had learned to operate by moonlight and instinct, began shooting down German night raiders. Specialized anti-shipping Hurricanes, armed with 40mm cannon, devastated German convoys off the French coast. But the Hurricane's greatest contribution was already complete. In the summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, when invasion barges massed across the Channel, when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance, the Hurricane had stopped the Luftwaffe cold. German pilots who had mocked it as a flying haystack in May were calling it the Widowmaker by October, and they weren't laughing anymore. The Hurricane remained in production through 1944, with over 14,000 built. It served in every theatre of war, from the frozen skies over Murmansk to the jungles of Burma. It shot down more German aircraft in the Mediterranean than any other Allied fighter. It destroyed more tanks in North Africa than any other aircraft. It defended Malta, covered the Dieppe raid, fought in India and the Middle East. But its finest hour, the moment that justified every design decision Sidney Cam had made in 1933, came in those desperate months over Britain in 1940. At the RAF Museum in Hendon, a restored Hurricane Mk sits in a place of honour. Its placard lists the specifications: maximum speed 305 miles per hour, service ceiling 36,000 feet, armament 8 303 Browning machine guns. The statistics don't capture what made the Hurricane special. Below the aircraft is a section of fabric recovered from a Hurricane that fought in the Battle of Britain. The fabric is torn and patched, showing over 30 bullet and cannon holes. A small plaque next to it contains a quote from an unnamed Luftwaffe pilot, taken from a 1940 interrogation report. "We called them flying haystacks when we first saw them, old-fashioned, slow, easy targets. We stopped laughing after the first attacks. The British fighters that looked antiquated were unkillable, and their guns, those 8 machine guns, they cut through our bombers like farm scythes through wheat. We shot at them with everything we had. They flew through our fire and never stopped shooting." By September, we dreaded seeing them. The thick-winged British fighters were death itself. In May 1985, at a reunion of Battle of Britain veterans in London, German and British fighter pilots met in peace for the first time. Günther Rall, by then a retired general, was asked about his memories of fighting Hurricanes. His response, captured on film by the BBC, showed how completely the Hurricane had reversed German opinions. "In May 1940 we thought we were flying the best fighters in the world. Modern, fast, powerful. Then we encountered the Hurricane. It looked like something from the previous war. We laughed. The laughter stopped very quickly. The first time I shot at a Hurricane I used all my cannon ammunition. The fighter kept flying. I couldn't believe it. Everything I knew about air combat said that much damage should destroy 3 aircraft. But the Hurricane flew home. When Hurricanes got their guns on target, our aircraft simply ceased to exist. I watched a Hurricane destroy a Dornier bomber in perhaps 2 seconds of firing. The bomber didn't just go down, it disintegrated. Pieces everywhere. The wings separated. The tail fell off. It was like watching a farmer with a scythe cutting wheat. The British built that. Fighter to win a war of attrition, and it did exactly that. Simple to build, simple to repair, almost impossible to destroy, and armed with firepower that was frankly terrifying. We lost the Battle of Britain because the Hurricane was better than anything we had. Not faster, not more manoeuvrable, just better at the one thing that mattered: surviving and destroying the enemy. Adolf Galland, the man who had shot down one of the first Hurricanes to fall in May 1940, was also at that reunion. When asked the famous question about what he needed to win the Battle of Britain, he gave his famous answer about wanting a squadron of Spitfires. But privately, to a small group of RAF Hurricane pilots, he admitted something different. "I said Spitfires because that's what Göring wanted to hear. The Spitfire was glamorous, famous, beautiful. But if you ask what really stopped us, what really defeated the Luftwaffe over Britain, the answer is simple: the Hurricane. You flew an honest fighter, not the fastest, not the most modern, but honest. It did what it was designed to do perfectly. It protected your pilots, it destroyed our aircraft, and it could not be stopped. In May we mocked it. By October we feared it. The measure of any weapon is simple. Does it win? The Hurricane won." The last Hurricane in RAF service was retired in January 1947, ending a career that had spanned the most critical years of World War II. By then, jet aircraft were making all piston-engine fighters obsolete. But the Hurricane's legacy was secure. It had stopped the Luftwaffe when stopping them mattered most. It had proved that conservative design, reliability and firepower could defeat theoretical performance. It had shown that the best weapon isn't always the most sophisticated. Sometimes it's the one that works. Today, a dozen Hurricanes remain airworthy, flying at air shows and commemorations. They're always the crowd favourites, not because they're the fastest or most beautiful, but because everyone knows what they did. When you hear the deep throb of a Merlin engine, when you see those thick wings and boxy fuselage, you're not seeing an antiquated fighter. You're seeing the aircraft that saved Britain. German pilots mocked the Hurricane when they first saw it in 1940. They stopped mocking it after the first battles. By September, as their bomber formations were torn apart over London, as their fighters ran out of ammunition trying to kill the unkillable British fighters, as the invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely, they understood the truth. The Hurricane had beaten them, not through speed or sophistication, but through the simple, brutal effectiveness of 8 machine guns mounted in a fighter too tough to kill. The fabric-covered wings that had seemed so antiquated turned out to be a stroke of genius. The conservative construction that had looked outdated proved perfect for mass production and field repair. The thick wings that had seemed clumsy provided the stability to deliver devastating accurate fire. Everything the Germans had mocked turned out to be exactly what Britain needed. In the end, the Hurricane didn't need to be the fastest fighter or the most modern, it just needed to stop the Luftwaffe. And on that summer day in 1940, when Britain stood alone and the fate of the free world hung in the balance, the Hurricane did exactly that. The haystack had become a harvester, reaping the Luftwaffe over England. And by the time the last bombers limped back to France in October 1940, German pilots who had survived understood one thing clearly. They had mocked the wrong fighter. The Hurricane had spoken with 8 Browning machine guns, and Britain belonged to the Hurricane. The Hurricane's story didn't end over Britain in 1940. As the Luftwaffe retreated to night bombing and the immediate invasion threat receded, the Hurricane was already being dispatched to new theatres, where it would prove equally indispensable. In December 1940, the 1st Hurricane Squadron arrived in North Africa. The Western Desert Air Force needed fighters desperately to counter the Italian Regia Aeronautica and the arriving German Afrika Korps. What they got was a fighter perfectly suited to desert warfare. The Hurricane's radial maintenance philosophy proved ideal for desert conditions. Sandstorms that grounded more sophisticated aircraft barely affected Hurricane operations. Ground crews could strip and service a Merlin engine in the open desert, working by moonlight with basic tools. The fabric-covered control surfaces, instead of jamming with sand like metal surfaces, could be brushed clean. One squadron maintained 90% operational availability despite operating from dirt strips in conditions that would ground modern aircraft. Flight Lieutenant Neville Duke of a 112 Squadron arrived in North Africa in February 1941. His combat diary captured how the Hurricane adapted to new warfare. The Hurricane in the desert is a different beast than over England. We're not intercepting bomber streams anymore. We're fighting Italian and German fighters at low altitude, strafing convoys, attacking airfields. The Hurricane does all of it. The thick wings that made it stable for shooting at bombers make it equally stable for ground attack. The 8 guns that destroyed Heinkels tear apart trucks and tanks, and the toughness that let it survive cannon fire over Britain lets it survive ground fire over Libya. The Hurricane Mk2IB entered service in North Africa in April 1941, and it changed desert warfare. This variant replaced the 8 machine guns with 4 20mm Hispano cannon. Each gun fired explosive shells weighing 4 ounces at 600 rounds per minute. The concentrated firepower was devastating. A single Hurricane cannon fighter could destroy a Messerschmitt Bf-109 with a 1-second burst. 3 shells anywhere on the target was usually fatal. German pilots who had learned to absorb machine gun fire found that cannon shells simply tore their aircraft apart. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Luftwaffe's top scoring pilot in Africa with 158 victories, was asked in a 1942 interview what he feared most. His answer was immediate. The Hurricane with cannons, not the Spitfire, the Hurricane. When a Hurricane with 4 cannons gets on your tail, you have perhaps 2 seconds to evade. After that, you're dead. I've seen Messerschmitts explode from a single burst. The Hurricane's stability means British pilots rarely miss. But it was the Hurricane McWoody that became legendary in the desert. This variant, entering service in mid-1942, carried 2 40mm Vickers S-guns under the wings. Each gun fired shells originally designed for anti-tank use. Against German armour, the Hurricane 2ID became known as the Tank Buster. Squadron leader John Lapsley commanded 6th Squadron when they received the first Mk2IDs. His report to headquarters captured the aircraft's devastating effectiveness. The 40mm Hurricane is not a fighter in the conventional sense. It's an anti-tank weapon that happens to fly. The guns are massive, each weighs 400 pounds with ammunition. They fire shells that can penetrate 52 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. We attack German tank columns at low level, firing from behind at engine compartments and turret rings. A single hit usually results in catastrophic kill. Brewing up, the tank crews call it. I've personally destroyed 11 German tanks in 3 weeks of operations. My aircraft has taken ground fire on every mission and keeps flying. The effectiveness of tank-busting Hurricanes became so pronounced that German tank commanders in North Africa began requesting air cover specifically against Hurricanes. A captured German report from August 1942 stated, "British Hurricane aircraft armed with heavy cannon are causing unacceptable tank losses. These aircraft attack in pairs from astern at extremely low altitude. Our defensive machine gun fire is ineffective. The Hurricane appears immune to rifle-caliber weapons. Tank commanders are refusing to advance without Luftwaffe cover." During the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Hurricane tank busters of the Desert Air Force destroyed over 30 German tanks in the first 3 days of fighting. They operated in coordination with ground forces directed to targets by forward air controllers. The German retreat became a route partly because Hurricane attacks destroyed the tanks that would have covered the withdrawal. But the Hurricane's most desperate struggle was happening simultaneously on a tiny island in the Mediterranean. Malta, 60 miles south of Sicily, was Britain's only base between Gibraltar and Egypt. From Malta, submarines and aircraft interdicted Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Hitler and Mussolini understood that Malta had to be neutralized. Starting in January 1941, the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica began bombing Malta with an intensity that exceeded even the London Blitz. The first Hurricanes arrived in Malta in August 1940, flown from the aircraft carrier HMS Argus. They were desperately needed. Italian bombers were attacking the island multiple times daily, unopposed. The handful of Hurricanes that made it to Malta changed the equation immediately. Flight Lieutenant James McLachlan commanded the Hurricane detachment. His first combat report was brief. Intercepted formation of 10 SM-79 bombers, shot down 3, no losses. The Italians were not expecting fighters. But as German units reinforced the Italian Air Force, Malta's Hurricanes faced overwhelming odds. By March 1941, the island had fewer than 20 serviceable fighters, facing hundreds of Axis aircraft operating from Sicily. The Hurricane pilots flew 4, 5, 6 sorties per day. They landed, refueled, rearmed, and went back up. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft flying. The survival rate was appalling. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot on Malta in early 1941 was 4 weeks. But the Hurricanes kept flying. Squadron leader Jumbo Gracie, commanding 261 Squadron on Malta, kept a diary that documented the desperate struggle. March 15, 1941. We now have 11 serviceable Hurricanes. The Germans sent over 80 aircraft a day in 3 waves. We intercepted all 3 raids, shot down 7, probably destroyed 3 more, lost 2 Hurricanes, both pilots safe. 1 Hurricane landed with over 200 bullet holes. Airframe repair section patched it overnight. It flew 2 sorties today. March 23rd, down to 8 Hurricanes. German fighters are now escorting every raid with Bf-109Fs. Newer than our models, we're outnumbered 10-1 on every interception. But the Hurricanes keep flying and the Germans keep dying. Shot down a 109 today. The German pilot bailed out, was captured. He asked what British fighters we were flying. When told Hurricanes, he was shocked. He said we were supposed to have only obsolete fighters. He didn't think the Hurricane was obsolete after it shot him down. April 7th. We received 23 new Hurricanes delivered by HMS Ark Royal. Also 15 new pilots. The replacements are mostly combat virgins, fresh from training. The Hurricanes will keep them alive long enough to learn. A new pilot pranged his Hurricane on landing today, badly. Aircraft was flying again 6 hours later. Try doing that with a Spitfire. The siege of Malta reached its crescendo in April 1942. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by its failure to neutralize the island, launched Operation Fliegerfaust, Fist of the Flyers. German and Italian aircraft flew over 11,000 sorties against Malta in April alone, dropping more bombs per square mile than were dropped on London during the entire Blitz. The Hurricane squadrons were worn to breaking point. On April 20th, Malta had 27 serviceable fighters. Within a week, German bombing had reduced that to 6. But then HMS Wasp, an American aircraft carrier loaned to Britain, delivered 47 Spitfires to Malta. The Spitfires, faster and better at altitude than the Hurricane, would take over air superiority duties. But the Hurricanes didn't leave. Instead, they transitioned entirely to ground attack. Hurricane fighter bombers, carrying 500-pound bombs, began striking Axis airfields in Sicily. The Hurricanes that had defended Malta now went on the offensive. The transformation was captured by Wing Commander Hugh Pugh Lloyd, commanding air operations on Malta. The Hurricane is perhaps the most versatile fighter ever built. It defended Malta when we had nothing else. Now that Spitfires handle the German fighters, the Hurricanes bomb the German airfields. Same aircraft, same pilots, different mission. The Hurricane does all of it competently. I would rather have one Hurricane squadron than two squadrons of specialised aircraft. The Hurricane adapts. By August 1942, the siege of Malta was broken. The island had survived the most concentrated aerial assault in history. Hurricanes had been central to that survival. When King George VI awarded Malta the George Cross in April 1942, several of the defending Hurricane pilots were mentioned by name in the citation. While Malta endured and North Africa raged, Hurricanes were fighting on another front that would prove equally desperate: the frozen skies of Russia. In August 1941, Britain shipped 2,952 Hurricanes to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease aid. Soviet pilots were initially skeptical. They had been flying nimble fighters like the Yak-1 and Lajiji-3. The Hurricane seemed heavy and slow by comparison. Their opinions changed rapidly. The Hurricane's rugged construction proved ideal for Russian conditions. Soviet ground crews working in temperatures that reached -40 degrees found the Hurricane easier to maintain than Soviet designs. The Merlin engine, designed with British cold weather in mind, started reliably in conditions that froze Soviet engines solid. The simple construction meant repairs could be made with minimal tools in field conditions. But it was in combat that Soviet pilots learned to appreciate the Hurricane. German aircraft on the Eastern Front in 1941-42 were largely the same Bf-109s and bombers that the Hurricane had faced over Britain. Soviet pilots found that the 8 machine guns or 4 cannon armament was devastating against German aircraft. Soviet ace Boris Safonov flew Hurricanes with 72nd Fighter Regiment in defense of Murmansk. He became the first Allied pilot to shoot down a German aircraft over Soviet territory, destroying a Bf-110 on his first combat mission in a Hurricane. By April 1942, when he was killed in action, Safonov had claimed 25 victories, all in Hurricanes. His combat reports praised the British fighter. The Hurricane is an excellent gun platform. The 8 machine guns create firepower unknown in Soviet fighters. German bombers cannot withstand concentrated fire. The Hurricane's stability makes accurate gunnery simple. In turning combat with German fighters, the Hurricane's low wing loading provides advantages. The aircraft is honest and forgiving. It keeps inexperienced pilots alive. Soviet pilots adapted Hurricane tactics to Russian conditions. They discovered the Hurricane could operate from frozen lakes, something Soviet fighters struggled with. The wide landing gear distributed weight efficiently over ice. Squadrons would disperse to frozen lakes when German ground attacks threatened conventional airfields. The Hurricanes would be hidden under camouflage netting maintained in the open and flown from solid ice. The most unusual Hurricane variant operated on the Eastern Front as well. The Hurricane IIC, carrying 4 20mm cannon and RP-3 rockets, became a devastating ground attack platform. Soviet pilots used Hurricane rocket fighters to destroy German trains, tank columns, and fortifications. Each RP-3 rocket carried a 60-pound warhead. A Hurricane could carry 8 rockets, delivering firepower equivalent to a heavy cruiser's broadside. Lieutenant Anatoly Kukarenko flew Hurricane 2ICs in ground attack missions during the Battle of Stalingrad. His memoir, published in Russia in 1978, described Hurricane operations. We attacked German positions at first light, when their fighters were still on the ground. The Hurricane was slow, but that was an advantage at low level. We could see targets clearly, aim precisely. The 4 cannon and 8 rockets could destroy an entire German company in a single pass. I once destroyed 4 German trucks, 2 half-tracks, and a Panzer III with 1 attack run. The Hurricane absorbed ground fire that would have downed any other aircraft. I counted 72 hits on my Hurricane after one mission. Every hit was machine gun or rifle fire. None penetrated to critical systems. We patched the fabric, replaced one structural member, and I flew the aircraft again that evening. but perhaps the most improbable theatre for Hurricane operations was the Far East, where the fighter faced an opponent completely different from anything it had encountered in Europe. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, Hurricanes equipped several RAF squadrons in Malaya and Singapore. These were early Mk1 and Mk2 variants, considered obsolete in Europe, sent east where they weren't expected to face first-line opposition. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Japanese A/M-0 fighter was a revelation. Light, manoeuvrable, with exceptional range, the Zero outperformed the Hurricane in almost every measurable way. It was faster, could climb better, turn tighter, and had longer range. Japanese pilots, veterans of combat over China, were skilled and aggressive. The first Hurricane Zero encounter occurred on January 22, 1942, over Malaya. 8 Hurricanes of 232 Squadron intercepted a formation of 27 Japanese bombers, escorted by 12 Zeros. The result was a disaster. 5 Hurricanes were shot down, 2 more badly damaged. No Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Donahue, an American, volunteer flying Hurricanes with 258 Squadron, wrote in his diary, "The Zero is unlike anything we've faced. It turns inside us effortlessly. It climbs faster. Our only advantages are diving speed and firepower. The Hurricane is tough enough to survive hits that would down a Zero, and our 8 guns will destroy a Zero with a 1-second burst, but we have to get that burst, and the Zero doesn't let us." RAF tacticians quickly developed new procedures for Hurricane pilots fighting Zeros. Never dogfight. Use speed and firepower. Attack from altitude, fire, dive away. If caught by a Zero, dive at full throttle. The Hurricane's stronger structure allowed high-speed dives that could tear a Zero's wings off, use the Hurricane's toughness, absorb the first burst, then return fire. These tactics worked, but not well enough to prevent the fall of Malaya and Singapore. By February 1942, most Hurricanes in the theatre had been destroyed or abandoned, but then the Hurricane found a role in the Far East where it excelled: Burma. The defence of Burma became one of the Hurricane's finest campaigns. Operating from rough jungle airstrips, facing Japanese bombers and fighters, the Hurricane proved ideal for the conditions. It could operate from strips that would ground other fighters. Its tough construction shrugged off the tropical environment, and crucially, it could carry bombs and rockets for ground attack. Squadron leader Frank Carey, who had flown Hurricanes over France and Britain, took command of 135 Squadron in Burma in early 1942. His assessment of Hurricane operations in jungle warfare was insightful. Burma is where the Hurricane truly shows its versatility. We intercept Japanese bombers at altitude, strafe Japanese convoys at treetop level, and provide close air support for ground troops. The Hurricane does all of it from dirt strips that are barely cleared jungle. We rearm and refuel under the trees, camouflaged from Japanese reconnaissance. The aircraft absorbs tropical conditions that corrode other fighters, and when we do encounter Zeros, we use tactics that exploit our strengths. The Zero is more agile, but the Hurricane is tougher and hits harder. Hurricane pilots in Burma developed a tactic called hurry bombing, flying in at treetop level with 250-pound bombs, releasing just before pulling up over the target, then strafing with guns on the way out. Japanese positions in thick jungle that were invisible from altitude could be attacked with devastating precision. The Japanese learned to respect the Hurricane. A captured Japanese intelligence document from May 1943 assessed Allied fighters in Burma. The Hurricane is the primary British fighter in Burma. While inferior to the Zero in maneuverability, it presents significant challenges. The Hurricane's armament is the heaviest of any Allied fighter, 420mm cannon in current models. A single hit from Hurricane cannon fire can destroy any Japanese aircraft. The Hurricane's structural strength allows it to absorb battle damage that would down Japanese fighters. Multiple encounters have confirmed Hurricanes returning to base, with damage that should be fatal. Hurricane pilots have adapted tactics that minimize their aircraft's weaknesses. They refuse turning combat, using speed and diving attacks instead. When attacking ground targets, Hurricanes operate at extremely low altitude where interception is difficult. The Hurricane remained the primary RAF fighter in Burma until late 1943, when Spitfires began arriving in significant numbers. But Hurricane ground attack variants continued operating until 1945, supporting the British advance back through Burma. The last Hurricane combat mission of World War II was flown over Burma on January 8, 1945, a ground attack sortie against Japanese positions. Naval aviation provided yet another chapter in the Hurricane's war, the Sea Hurricane, developed for operations from aircraft carriers and merchant ships, entered service in early 1941. These were standard Hurricanes modified with catapult spools and arrestor hooks. The Sea Hurricane faced unique challenges. Carrier landings required precise speed control. Too fast and you'd miss the wires, too slow and you'd stall. The Hurricane's forgiving handling characteristics proved ideal. The wide landing gear provided stability on pitching carrier decks, and the toughness that had saved Hurricane pilots over land proved equally valuable at sea. The most desperate Sea Hurricane operations occurred on the Arctic convoys to Russia. German aircraft operating from Norway attacked the convoys with bombers and torpedo planes. The merchant ships of the convoys were fitted with catapults carrying a single Hurricane. Once launched, the Hurricane pilot had no way to land back on the ship. After engaging German aircraft, the pilot would fly toward the convoy and bail out, hoping to be picked up before dying of exposure in Arctic waters. These Hurricanes flew some of the most desperate missions of the war. The pilot knew that launching meant almost certainly ditching in freezing water, but the alternative was letting German bombers sink the convoy unchallenged. Lieutenant Robert Everett flew a Hurricane on convoy PQ-16 in May 1942. His combat report, filed after being rescued from Arctic waters, was matter-of-fact. Launched at 1340 hours to intercept formation of Aritiuns, he 111 bombers attacking convoy, destroyed 1 bomber, damaged 2 more. Remaining bombers broke off attack. After ensuring bombers had departed, I flew ahead of convoy and bailed out at 500 feet. I was in the water for 22 minutes before HMS Volunteer picked me up. The Hurricane sank immediately upon impact. I would do it again tomorrow if required. Everett survived, many Hurricane pilots didn't. But the convoys they protected carried vital war material to Russia, and the Hurricanes ensured those convoys got through. Fleet carriers used Sea Hurricanes extensively in the Mediterranean. During Operation Pedestal in August 1942, the convoy that broke the siege of Malta, Sea Hurricanes from HMS Indomitable shot down multiple German and Italian aircraft while protecting the merchant ships. The Hurricane service record expanded to include aircraft types that barely resembled the original fighter. The Hurricane Mk 4, entering service in 1943, was essentially a flying weapons platform. It could carry anti-tank guns, rockets, bombs, or long-range fuel tanks. One variant carried 8 RP-3 rockets plus 2 500-pound bombs, nearly a ton of ordnance. These late-war Hurricanes weren't fighters in the conventional sense. They were ground attack aircraft that happened to be built on a fighter airframe, and they were devastatingly effective. During the D-Day landings in June 1944, Hurricane ground attack squadrons provided close air support for the invasion forces. They struck German defensive positions, destroyed tanks, and attacked German reinforcements moving toward the beaches. The Hurricane's ability to operate from rough forward airfields meant it could base close to the front lines, providing immediate response to ground force requests. RAF pilot Pierre Closterman, a French ace who flew Spitfires but observed Hurricane operations in Normandy, wrote admiringly of them, "The Hurricane pilots are doing the war's dirtiest work. They fly at 50 feet through ground fire that would terrify anyone. They attack tanks, trains, trucks, anything that moves. They take losses that would break any other squadron, and they keep flying." The Hurricane is obsolete as a fighter by 1944 standards, but as a ground attack aircraft it's irreplaceable. I watched a Hurricane take a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over Caen. The shell exploded against the underside of the fuselage. Pieces flew off. The Hurricane climbed, completed its attack run, and flew home. That's the Hurricane. Too tough to kill, even when it should be dead. By 1944, faster and more capable fighters like the Spitfire, P-51 Mustang and Tempest had taken over air superiority duties. But the Hurricane remained valuable because it could do things those sophisticated fighters couldn't. It could operate from fields that were barely more than flattened mud. It could be maintained by ground crews with basic tools. It could absorb damage and keep flying, and it could deliver massive ordnance loads accurately at low level. The final Hurricane combat missions in Europe were flown in April 1945 as the war ground toward its conclusion. Appropriately, they were ground attack missions, Hurricanes striking German transport targets in northern Germany. Production ended in September 1944 with the 14.483rd Hurricane. By any measure, it was one of the most successful military aircraft ever built. It had equipped 97 squadrons in the RAF alone, plus numerous squadrons in Allied air forces. It had served in every theatre of World War II. It had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other British fighter. It had carried more ground attack ordnance than any other single-engine Allied aircraft. And it had done all of this while being consistently underestimated. The Hurricane's story is fundamentally about getting the basics right. It wasn't the fastest fighter, or the most manoeuvrable, or the most heavily armed, or the longest ranged. But it was fast enough, manoeuvrable enough, heavily armed enough, and its range was adequate. What it excelled at was reliability, ease of production, ease of repair, and structural toughness. Sidney Cam's conservative design choices in 1933, the tubular frame, the fabric covering, the thick wings, had all seemed like compromises, even mistakes. But they turned out to be exactly what was needed. The tubular frame was stronger and easier to repair than stressed skin construction. The fabric covering allowed explosive shells to pass through without detonating. The thick wings provided stability and could carry massive weapons loads. The Hurricane succeeded because it was designed for war, not for peacetime demonstrations. Cam understood that in combat, maintenance matters as much as performance. Repair speed matters as much as top speed. Survivability matters as much as maneuverability. The Hurricane prioritized all the unglamorous characteristics that win wars. German pilots in 1940 had mocked the Hurricane's appearance. They were still thinking about peacetime air shows and speed records. The Hurricane's designers were thinking about sustained combat operations from improvised airfields by partially trained pilots and mechanics. That difference in perspective decided the Battle of Britain. The final assessment of the Hurricane came not from British sources but from its enemies. After the war, captured German aircraft designers were asked to evaluate British fighters. Their assessment of the Hurricane, included in the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee reports, was revealing. The Hurricane represented a design philosophy fundamentally different from German practice. German fighters prioritized performance and sophisticated systems. The Hurricane prioritized reliability and ease of production. In retrospect, the British approach was superior for total war. The Hurricane could be produced faster, maintained easier, and repaired quicker than any comparable German aircraft. More importantly, the Hurricane's robust construction gave it survivability that no German fighter could match. Our pilots consistently reported that Hurricanes absorbed damage that should have been fatal. This single characteristic may have decided the Battle of Britain. We shot down Hurricanes, but not fast enough. They kept coming. British factories replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. The Hurricane's simple construction was not a weakness. It was its greatest strength. Today, only a handful of airworthy Hurricanes remain. Each is treasured, maintained by dedicated teams who understand that these aircraft represent more than vintage technology. They represent the moment when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and refused to surrender. When a Hurricane flies at an air show, the sound is distinctive. The Merlin engine's characteristic rumble, deeper than a Spitfire's howl, speaks of strength and reliability. The flight characteristics are graceful but workmanlike. No flashy aerobatics, just solid, competent flying. The Hurricane looks exactly like what it is, an honest, functional weapon designed to win a war. The pilots who flew Hurricanes in combat are nearly all gone now. But their testimonies remain consistent. The Hurricane was never the aircraft they dreamed of flying. It wasn't glamorous like the Spitfire or fast like the Mustang. But it was the aircraft they trusted with their lives. It brought them home when it shouldn't have been able to. It destroyed enemies when they needed it to. It never quit. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Page, who was shot down and badly burned flying a Hurricane in 1940, later wrote the most succinct tribute to the aircraft. "I owe my life to the Hurricane. Not once, but many times. It absorbed punishment that should have killed me. It flew when it had no right to fly. It fought when other aircraft would have fallen from the sky. The Hurricane was never beautiful, never the fastest, never the star. But it was always there, always reliable, always deadly. In 1940, when civilization itself hung in the balance, the Hurricane was exactly the weapon Britain needed, and it won. That, in the end, is the Hurricane's legacy. Not the most advanced fighter of World War II, but the right fighter at the right time. The Germans mocked it. The Germans learned to fear it. And when the Battle of Britain ended, the Hurricane had proved that conservative engineering, rugged construction, and concentrated firepower could defeat theoretical performance. The flying haystack had saved Britain, and in doing so had helped save the world.